The party was already winding down when Eric found me on the balcony, nursing the last dregs of my drink. The city sprawled below us, a chaotic tangle of lights and sounds, but up here it was quiet. Just the occasional hum of distant traffic and the murmur of voices inside. I didn't hear him approach at first, too lost in my thoughts, but then his familiar voice broke the stillness. "Ben, you hiding out here?" I turned to see him leaning casually against the doorframe, his usual confident smirk softened by the glow of the city lights. Eric and I had been friends for years. We met in college, roommates by chance, but friends by choice. He was the life of every party, always surrounded by people who were drawn to his charm. I was quieter, content to stand in his orbit and watch the world from a comfortable distance. "Just needed some air," I replied, gesturing with my glass. He stepped closer, the warmth of his presence cutting through the cool night air. "Big parties aren't your thing, huh?" I shrugged. "Not really, but you already knew that." Eric chuckled, a low, rich sound that always managed to put me at ease. "True, but I didn't think you'd bail on me this early." "I didn't bail," I said, a little defensively. "I'm right here." "Fair enough." He joined me at the railing, leaning forward so his shoulder almost brushed mine. For a moment, neither of us spoke. We just stood there, looking out at the city, letting the quiet stretch between us. It wasn't awkward, though. With Eric, it never was. "You've been off tonight," he said suddenly, breaking the silence. "What's going on?" "Nothing," I lied, taking a sip of my drink to avoid his gaze. Eric wasn't buying it. "Come on, Ben. I know you better than that." There it was, that easy confidence, the way he could read me like an open book. It was both comforting and disarming. I sighed, setting my glass on the railing. "It's just a lot of people. Loud. You know how I get—" "Yeah, I do." He turned to face me fully, his expression softer now, almost concerned. "You don't have to stay if you don't want to. No one's keeping you here." "You are," I said before I could stop myself. The words hung in the air between us, heavier than I intended. Eric's eyes searched mine, something unspoken passing between us. I looked away, suddenly self-conscious. "Ben." His voice was quieter now, more tentative. "It's fine," I said quickly, trying to backtrack. "Forget I said anything." But Eric wasn't letting it go. He reached out, his hand brushing my arm lightly, sending a jolt of warmth through me. "Hey, talk to me. What's going on?" I hesitated, torn between wanting to keep the peace and the overwhelming urge to tell him the truth. The latter won out, albeit reluctantly. "It's just, sometimes I feel like I don't quite fit into your world, like I'm always on the outside looking in." Eric frowned, his grip on my arm tightening just slightly. "That's not true, Ben. You're my best friend. You're not on the outside." "I don't mean it like that," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "It's just, I don't know. Forget it." "No," he said firmly, "I'm not forgetting it. If something's bothering you, I want to know." I met his gaze then, the intensity in his eyes making it impossible to look away. There was something there, something I couldn't quite name but felt all the same. My heart was racing, my thoughts a chaotic jumble, and then, before I could stop myself, I said the words I'd been holding back for years. "I think I'm in love with you." The world seemed to stop. For a long moment, Eric just stared at me, his expression unreadable. My stomach twisted with panic. I wanted to take it back, to laugh it off as a joke, but it was too late. The truth was out, and there was no taking it back. "Ben." He said my name softly, almost like a question. "Forget I said anything," I blurted, stepping back. "I shouldn't have." But before I could finish, Eric closed the distance between us, his hand cupping the back of my neck as he kissed me. It was soft at first, tentative, as if he was testing the waters. But then it deepened, and all the tension, all the unspoken feelings that had been building for years came rushing out. For a moment I couldn't think, couldn't breathe. All I could do was feel. His lips on mine, his hand in my hair, the warmth of his body pressed against mine. It was overwhelming and perfect and everything I didn't know I needed. When we finally pulled apart, both of us were breathing hard. Eric looked at me, his eyes full of something I'd never seen before. "You're not on the outside, Ben. You never were." "Eric," I started, but he silenced me with another kiss, his hands pulling me closer as if he couldn't bear to let me go. And in that moment, nothing else mattered. Not the party, not the city below us, not even the years of fear and doubt that had kept me silent for so long. It was just us, standing on the balcony, our world forever changed. The kiss lingered in my mind long after it ended, replaying in vivid detail as if my brain refused to let go of the moment. Eric's warmth, the undeniable certainty in the way he held me, had dismantled the careful walls I'd built to contain feelings I never thought would see the light of day. I pulled back slightly, resting my forehead against his, trying to steady the hurricane of emotions swirling inside me. The air between us felt electric, charged with possibilities I wasn't sure how to navigate. For all his charm and confidence, Eric looked as unsure as I felt. His fingers still brushed my neck, hesitant now, as if afraid I might step back completely. "Ben," he said softly, almost a whisper, his voice breaking through the silence. I didn't expect that, but I don't regret it." My breath hitched at his words, a mixture of relief and disbelief washing over me. "You don't?" He shook his head, a small smile playing at the corner of his lips. Yeah, I didn't see it coming, but it felt right, didn't it?" I nodded slowly, my throat tight. "It did, more than I expected." A short laugh escaped him, almost nervous. "So, what now?" The question hung in the air, heavy with implications. We both knew the line we'd crossed couldn't be erased. There was no pretending this didn't just happen, but the enormity of what it meant loomed between us. "I don't know," I admitted, my voice barely audible. "I wasn't expecting any of this." Eric stepped closer, his hand slipping down to rest lightly on my shoulders. "Me neither. But if I'm being honest—" He hesitated, his gaze dropping for a moment before locking back onto mine. "I've always felt something. I just never thought that I felt the same," I finished for him, my heart pounding in my chest. He nodded. "Yeah, I guess I was too afraid to risk it, you know? Didn't want to screw up what we have." I swallowed hard, his words hitting home. The fear of losing him, of complicating our friendship beyond repair, had kept me silent for years. But now, standing here with the taste of his kiss still on my lips, I couldn't imagine going back to the way things were. "Eric, this changes everything," I said, my voice trembling. "Are you sure about this?" He smiled then, a genuine, reassuring smile that eased some of the tension in my chest. "I'm sure about you, Ben. I don't know what this means or where it's going, but I know I don't want to run from it anymore." "Do you?" The sincerity in his eyes melted the last of my resistance. I shook my head, a small smile tugging at my lips. "I don't." His grin widened, the relief evident on his face. "Good," he said, pulling me into a tight hug. The familiar scent of him, the solid warmth of his body against mine, felt like coming home. I closed my eyes, letting myself sink into the moment. We stood like that for what felt like an eternity, the distant sounds of the city fading into the background. For the first time in a long time, I felt like I was exactly where I was meant to be. Eric finally pulled back, his hands still resting on my arms. "Come back inside," he asked, his tone softer now, almost shy. I hesitated, the noise and lights of the party suddenly feeling intrusive. "I don't think I can," I admitted. "Not right now." He nodded, understanding flickering across his face. "Do you want to head home? I can come with you, or—" The idea of being alone with Eric, away from prying eyes and the chaos of the party, was both exhilarating and terrifying. But the thought of retreating to my apartment without him felt unbearable. "Yeah," I said finally, my voice steadier now. "Let's go." Eric didn't hesitate. He reached for my hand, lacing his fingers through mine in a way that felt so natural it took my breath away. Together, we slipped through the apartment, avoiding the crowd as best we could. A few people called out to Eric, but he waved them off with his usual charm, his hand never leaving mine. The cool night air hit us as we stepped onto the street. The tension that had gripped me all evening began to ease, replaced by a nervous excitement. Eric glanced at me, his eyes warm and full of something I couldn't quite name. "My place or yours?" he asked, his tone light but his expression serious. "Mine," I said, the word slipping out before I could second-guess it. My apartment felt safer, less charged with memories of the life we'd shared as just friends. The short walk to my building passed in a blur. Eric stayed close, his hand brushing against mine occasionally as we walked. Neither of us spoke much, but the silence between us was comfortable, filled with a sense of anticipation. When we finally reached my door, I fumbled with the keys, my hands trembling slightly. Eric's steady presence behind me was both grounding and electrifying. As the door swung open, I turned to him, suddenly unsure of what came next. But Eric didn't hesitate. He stepped inside, his gaze meeting mine with a mixture of confidence and vulnerability. "Ben, He trailed off, taking a step closer. "I don't want to mess this up." "You're not," I said quickly, reaching out to touch his arm. "I promise. You're not." Something in him seemed to relax at my words. He smiled, that lopsided grin I'd always loved, and cupped my face gently in his hands. "Then let's figure this out. Together." He kissed me again, slower this time, as if savoring the moment. His hands slid down to rest on my waist, pulling me closer. I melted into him, my arms wrapping around his neck as the world outside faded away. The tension that had been simmering between us for years finally gave way, replaced by a warmth that spread through me like fire. This was uncharted territory, and I had no idea where it would lead. But as Eric's lips moved against mine, one thought echoed in my mind. I didn't want to let this go. Eric's kiss deepened, his hands firm but tender as they gripped my waist. My apartment felt impossibly small, the air thick with a mix of emotions I couldn't quite articulate. Every touch, every press of his lips against mine, felt like breaking a dam, releasing years of tension and unspoken desire. My fingers curled into the fabric of his shirt, desperate to hold on to something solid as the world spun around us. When we finally broke apart, both of us breathless, Eric rested his forehead against mine. His hands slid up to cradle my face, his thumbs brushing against my cheeks. His touch was electric, sending sparks down my spine. "Ben," he murmured, his voice low and rough, "this feels—" I don't even know how to put it into words, but I know it feels right. "Do you?" I nodded, my breath still catching. "Yeah, it does." He smiled, his expression softening. "Good, because I don't want to screw this up. I don't want to screw us up." "You won't," I promised, my voice barely a whisper. The sincerity in his eyes made my chest tighten. "We'll figure it out." The weight of those words hung between us, a silent acknowledgement of the line we'd crossed and the uncertainty of what lay ahead. But for once, the fear didn't outweigh the possibility. I wanted to see where this could go, to let myself feel without overthinking every consequence. Eric pulled me into another hug, his arms wrapping tightly around me. I buried my face in his shoulder, the familiar scent of him grounding me. We stood there for a while, neither of us speaking, just holding on to each other as if the rest of the world didn't exist. When he finally pulled back, there was a hint of mischief in his smile. "So, this is your apartment, huh? Gotta say, I was expecting something, I don't know, more Ben." I laughed despite myself, the sound breaking through the tension that had settled over us. "What's that supposed to mean?" "You know," he said, gesturing around the room. "Minimalist, all neutral colors, maybe a few plants you forgot to water. It's cozy." "It's not that bad," I protested, though I couldn't stop the smile tugging at my lips. "And, for the record, I water my plants." "Sure you do." He grinned, his teasing tone lightening the mood further. I shook my head, walking over to the small couch that dominated the living room. Sitting down, I gestured for him to join me. He hesitated for a moment, as if debating whether to keep up the banter, but then he sat down beside me, close enough that our knees touched. For a moment, we just looked at each other, the weight of everything settling back in. Eric reached for my hand, threading his fingers through mine. The simple gesture sent a wave of warmth through me, the intimacy of it somehow more profound than the kisses we'd shared. "I've been thinking about this for a long time," he admitted, his voice softer now. "About you." My throat tightened, the raw honesty in his words catching me off guard. "You have?" He nodded, his thumb tracing lazy circles on the back of my hand. "Yeah, I didn't know how to bring it up, or if I even should." "Why now?" The question slipped out before I could stop it, my curiosity outweighing my fear of the answer. Eric's gaze dropped for a moment, his expression thoughtful. "I think I just got tired of pretending, of acting like you're just my friend when you're not. You never were." His words hit me like a punch to the chest, knocking the air from my lungs. "Eric." He looked up then, his eyes meeting mine with an intensity that made it impossible to look away. "You don't have to say anything," he said quickly, almost as if he were afraid I might take it all back. "I just needed you to know." I squeezed his hand, my voice steady despite the storm of emotions swirling inside me. "I'm glad you told me, because I feel the same way." The relief that washed over his face was palpable. He let out a soft laugh, shaking his head. "God, I've been driving myself crazy thinking about this." "Me too," I admitted, a small smile tugging at my lips. "But I'm glad it's out now." "Me too." He leaned in then, his lips brushing against mine in a kiss that was slower, more deliberate. It wasn't about urgency or passion this time. It was about connection, about solidifying what had been unspoken for so long. When we pulled apart, Eric rested his head against the back of the couch, his hand still intertwined with mine. "This is going to change everything, isn't it?" "Yeah," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "But maybe that's not such a bad thing." He turned his head to look at me, his smile soft but full of something I couldn't quite name. "No, it's not." We sat there in comfortable silence, the weight of what we'd just admitted to each other settling around us. It wasn't heavy, though. It felt almost freeing, like we'd finally stepped into a truth that had been waiting for us all along. After a while, Eric stood, his hand still holding mine. "Come on," he said, tugging me gently. "Let's not spend the whole night sitting here." I let him pull me up, following him to the bedroom with a mixture of nerves and excitement coursing through me. The room was small, barely big enough for the bed and a dresser, but it felt like a world unto itself as Eric turned to face me. His hands found my waist, his touch steady and grounding. "Are you sure about this?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. I nodded, my hands resting on his chest. "I've never been more sure of anything." He smiled then, a soft, genuine smile that made my chest ache. And as he kissed me again, I felt the last of my doubts melt away. This was uncharted territory, but it felt like exactly where I was supposed to be. The warmth of Eric's hands on my waist was grounding, but it couldn't fully still. The rush of nerves coursing through me. Every sensation felt amplified. The softness of his breath on my skin, the way his fingers pressed just firmly enough to reassure me. He tilted his head slightly, his lips brushing mine in a kiss that was somehow both tender and insistent. I let myself sink into it, my hands sliding up to grip his shoulders as if he were the only thing keeping me upright. We broke apart just enough to breathe, our foreheads resting against each other as we stood in the small, dimly lit room. Eric's voice broke the silence, rough and low in a way that sent a shiver down my spine. "Ben," he said, my name coming out like a confession. "I've thought about this so many times, and now that it's happening, it doesn't even feel real." "It feels real to me," I murmured, my voice steadier than I expected. "And I don't want it to stop." He pulled back just enough to look at me, his hands sliding up to cup my face. His thumbs brushed over my cheekbones in a gesture so intimate it made my chest ache. "Neither do I," he said simply, and in that moment, it was all the reassurance I needed. He kissed me again, deeper this time, his lips parting against mine in a way that sent a surge of heat through my body. His hands moved to my back, pulling me closer until there was no space left between us. The kiss grew more urgent, and I could feel the weight of everything we'd been holding back pouring into it. Every touch, every press of his body against mine, was a revelation. I let out a shaky breath as his lips left mine to trail along my jawline, then lower to the sensitive skin of my neck. My head tilted back instinctively, giving him access as my fingers tangled in his hair. The world outside the room faded into nothingness, leaving only the two of us and the electricity crackling between us. Eric's hands found the hem of my shirt, and he hesitated, his eyes flicking up to meet mine. "Is this okay?" he asked, his voice soft but tinged with urgency. "Yes," I said without hesitation, the word barely a whisper. My heart was racing, but it wasn't fear or doubt. It was anticipation, a yearning I hadn't fully acknowledged until now. He slid the fabric up and over my head, his fingers grazing my skin in a way that made me shiver. I mirrored his movements, tugging his shirt off and letting it fall to the floor. His chest was warm under my hands, and I couldn't help but marvel at the strength I felt there. I traced the lines of his shoulders, his collarbone, memorizing the way his body felt under my touch. Eric's lips found mine again, more insistent this time as he guided us toward the bed. We tumbled onto it in a tangle of limbs, our movements clumsy but full of a shared urgency. The weight of him above me, the way his hands moved over my skin, was overwhelming in the best way. For the first time in years, I let myself be completely vulnerable. I let myself feel everything. The nervous flutter in my stomach, the heat pooling low in my body, the undeniable connection that seemed to hum in the air between us. Eric's kisses were everywhere, his touch lighting a fire that burned away every doubt, every hesitation. "Ben," he whispered against my skin, his voice thick with emotion. "You're incredible. Do you know that?" I shook my head, unable to find words, but the look in his eyes told me he meant it. The tenderness in his gaze made my chest tighten, and I reached up to pull him into another kiss, needing to feel the reassurance of his presence. Time lost meaning as we explored each other, our movements growing more confident as the night went on. It was slow at first, almost reverent, as if we were afraid to rush and miss the weight of what was happening. But as the barriers between us disappeared, the urgency returned, and we gave ourselves over to it completely. Every touch, every kiss, felt like a revelation, a breaking down of walls I hadn't realized I'd built. Eric's hands moved over me with a care that made my breath catch, his touch sending sparks of pleasure coursing through me. He murmured my name like it was the only word he knew, his voice filled with a rawness that matched the emotions welling up inside me. When we finally collapsed back onto the bed, our bodies tangled together. The room was filled with the sound of our ragged breathing. The weight of what had just happened settled over us, but it wasn't heavy. It was comforting, a quiet reminder of how far we'd come in just a few hours. Eric's arm draped over my waist, his fingers tracing lazy patterns on my skin. "You okay?" he asked softly, his voice laced with a tenderness that made my heart ache. I turned to look at him, his face so close to mine that I could see every detail. The curve of his lips, the faint shadow of stubble along his jaw, the vulnerability in his eyes. "Yeah," I said, my voice steady. "Better than okay." He smiled at that, a soft, genuine smile that sent a wave of warmth through me. "Good," he said, leaning in to press a gentle kiss to my forehead. "Because I don't want this to be a one-time thing, Ben. I don't want to wake up tomorrow and pretend this didn't happen." "Neither do I admitted, my voice barely above a whisper. The thought of going back to how things were before felt impossible now. I didn't want to hide from this anymore, didn't want to shove my feelings into some dark corner of my mind and pretend they didn't exist. Eric tightened his arm around me, pulling me closer until my head was resting against his chest. His heartbeat was steady beneath my ear, a soothing rhythm that matched the contentment settling over me. "Then, let's figure it out," he said, his voice low and sure. "Whatever this is, wherever it takes us, let's figure it out together." "Together," I echoed, the word feeling like a promise. We stayed like that for the rest of the night, wrapped in each other's warmth as the world outside faded away. For the first time in a long time, I felt like I was exactly where I was meant to be. The first light of dawn filtered through the blinds, casting faint streaks of gold across the room. Eric's arm was still draped over me, his breathing slow and even, the steady rise and fall of his chest grounding me in the moment. I didn't want to move, didn't want to disturb the fragile peace that had settled over us. For so long I had buried these feelings, convinced they were impossible, that he could never see me the same way I saw him. But here we were, tangled together in the soft glow of morning, the impossible made real. Eric stirred slightly, his grip tightening around me as he let out a low, sleepy hum. His eyes fluttered open, and when he looked at me, his smile was immediate, unguarded. "Morning," he murmured, his voice rough with sleep. "Morning," I replied, my own smile matching his. For a moment we just lay there, staring at each other, the silence between us filled with unspoken questions and quiet assurances. There was something about the way he looked at me, like I was the only thing in the world that mattered, that made my chest ache. "Are you okay?" he asked, his hand reaching up to brush a stray strand of hair from my forehead. His touch was soft, careful, as if he were afraid I might slip away. I nodded, the weight of his concern and care almost overwhelming. "Yeah," I said softly. "More than okay." His smile widened, a hint of relief flickering across his face. "Good, because I meant what I said last night, Ben. I want to figure this out, with you." The sincerity in his voice was undeniable, and for the first time in years, I let myself believe that this could work, that we could be more than just friends fumbling in the dark. "Me too," I said, my voice steady despite the emotions threatening to bubble over. "I don't want to go back to how things were. I don't think I could." "You won't have to," he said firmly, his thumb tracing lazy circles on my cheek. "We're in this together now." I leaned into his touch, my eyes closing briefly as I let his words sink in. Together. The idea of it felt foreign and exhilarating all at once. There was no roadmap for where we were headed, no guarantees that it wouldn't be messy or complicated, but as I opened my eyes and met Eric's gaze, I knew I wanted to try. The morning stretched on, the two of us reluctant to leave the cocoon of the bed and the safety we'd found in each other. We talked in hushed tones, sharing bits of ourselves that we'd never dared to before. Eric admitted how long he'd been wrestling with his feelings, how he'd almost told me a dozen times but always stopped himself out of fear. I told him about the nights I'd spent wondering if I was crazy for thinking there could ever be more between us. "I guess we're both idiots," he said with a laugh, his fingers tracing patterns along my arm. "Idiots who finally got it right," I countered, grinning at him. His laughter faded into a soft smile, and he leaned in to press a lingering kiss to my forehead. "I like the sound of that." Eventually, reality intruded, the day waiting for us beyond the walls of my apartment. Eric was the first to pull away, though I could tell he did so reluctantly. "We should probably get moving," he said, his tone tinged with regret. "People are going to wonder where we disappeared to last night." I groaned, flopping back against the pillows. Let them wonder. He laughed, the sound warm and infectious. As much as I'd love to stay here all day, we're going to have to face them eventually. I sighed, knowing he was right but not wanting to admit it. Fine, I said, sitting up and running a hand through my hair. But you're explaining why we both bailed. Deal, he said, leaning in to steal one last kiss before pulling himself out of bed. The morning passed in a blur of stolen glances and soft touches as we got ready to face the world outside. It was strange, this new dynamic between us, but it also felt natural in a way I hadn't expected. Every time Eric's hand brushed against mine or his eyes lingered on me a moment too long, I felt a warmth bloom in my chest, a quiet reassurance that this was real. When we finally stepped out of the apartment, the city was already alive with the hum of life. Eric reached for my hand without hesitation, threading his fingers through mine as we walked. The simple gesture made my heart race, and I couldn't stop the smile that spread across my face. People are going to stare, I said, half joking. Let them, he replied, his grip on my hand tightening. I don't care what anyone thinks. Do you? I shook my head, my smile softening. Not anymore. We walked in comfortable silence, the noise of the city fading into the background. For the first time in years, I felt light, like a weight I hadn't realized I was carrying had finally been lifted. Eric's presence beside me was steady, grounding, and I found myself wondering how I'd ever managed without it. As we turned the corner onto a quieter street, Eric stopped abruptly, pulling me to a halt. He turned to face me, his expression serious. Ben, I need you to know something. What is it? I asked, my heart skipping a beat. He took a deep breath, his thumb brushing over my knuckles. I'm not going anywhere. Whatever this is, whatever it becomes, I'm in it for the long haul. You're not just a fling or a question I need answered. You're everything. His words hit me like a freight train, the raw honesty in them leaving me momentarily speechless. I swallowed hard, my throat tight with emotion. Eric, But before I could finish, he kissed me, the world falling away as his lips met mine. It wasn't rushed or urgent. It was steady, grounding, filled with the quiet certainty of someone who knew exactly what they wanted. When he pulled back, his forehead rested against mine, his eyes searching mine for a response. I feel the same, I said finally, my voice trembling but sure. I'm all in, Eric. His smile was blinding, and he pulled me into a hug, his arms wrapping around me tightly. Good, he murmured against my ear, because I'm not letting you go. And as we stood there on the quiet street, wrapped in each other's arms, I knew that whatever challenges lay ahead, we would face them together. For the first time in years, I wasn't afraid of what the future might hold. I had Eric, and that was more than enough.